Hey everyone, welcome to week 72. Today is day 3, Wednesday. This is our third day on our ongoing What Can I Learn from Caravaggio week. So we'll see how we're going to do.
Okay, let's get started. This is day 3. This is our third day on our What Can We Learn from Caravaggio week. Remember, if you're interested in this week, maybe you will find our first What Can I Learn From week also interesting, where we studied Rembrandt. So if you've enjoyed these past couple of videos, be sure to check that week out. I think that one thing is very apparent from the first 2 paintings that we've done during this week, which is that our aim is not going to be to try and paint like Caravaggio. I mean, we could have that as our sole objective. Our goal for this week, even though I'm pretty sure a week is not close to being enough time to try to begin to understand how to paint in a Caravaggisti manner, that would probably take years, decades. But we could have done a sort of introduction to try and construct paintings in the manner in which Caravaggio used to construct them. And we could have done a study in the nature of light, the setup of light that we have to use to try and echo the lighting condition that Caravaggio so masterfully depicted. We would also have to understand our environment. So a small north light window, which is probably what Caravaggio used, is not the only thing that we need. We also need a space that is large enough to accommodate freely posing a model, but also dark enough where that single source of light doesn't end up flooding the space, providing us with ambient lighting that is going to end up filling our shadows with information. What we want is a space that's dark enough where our light can't have incidence in our shadow mass. Our shadow mass is almost going to disappear into the atmosphere of that dark space that the figure inhabits. After that, it's just a study in depicting form, in understanding the modeling of form, in understanding structure. I hope I'm not making it sound like it's something simple, because it's not. That takes a long, long time. That can be a lifetime. Understanding form and how form turns in space, and to be able to do that in a realistic, sensible manner, that's a lifetime. You know, you could spend your whole life trying to do that consistently. So let's not minimize the fact that we could embark in this, very strange, I would say, endeavor of attempting to paint like Caravaggio, but that would obviously be impossible to do during a single week of painting. And aside from all the technical variables, I would say, what's the point? Honestly, what really is the point of trying to evoke 17th century painting in the 21st century? It just feels disconnected. So much of that painting, so much of that Baroque painting, particularly in Caravaggio's case, it was painting that was intrinsically tied to the church, to the Catholic Church. And that was the driving force for all these paintings. Yesterday I was mentioning how moving it was for me, and it always is, when we go to San Luigi dei Francesi and we're able to see the chapel that holds the trilogy of paintings that Caravaggio did of the history of St. Matthew. And I'm expressing how lucky we are because we're able to see the paintings in the place, in the exact place, in the exact atmosphere where they were originally meant to be hung. They were designed specifically for this space, and they were understood to be viewed in this space. And that is such a remarkable thing. That's such an incredible opportunity that we have as viewers to view these paintings as close to their original intent as we can access 430 years later. Because we're not going to be able to have that same exact experience that people who were able to observe them in the late 16th and early 17th century had, but we can at least understand the atmosphere that holds these paintings. And I think that that's something so incredible. I know that a lot of people that are able to see these paintings in these smaller chapels feel that it's kind of uncomfortable. The paintings are high up. These are large paintings, and they're not really easy to see in the sense that there's not quote unquote good lighting falling onto these paintings. I mean, the best scenario that people would have in the late 16th, early 17th century was to have the church illuminated by candles. But there's not enough sunlight filtering through the windows to give you a sense of what these paintings would look like that would be similar to somewhat natural lighting that we would have access to if we were looking at them in a controlled setup in a museum. So these are paintings that are not meant to be viewed as if they were part of a private collection. These are paintings that are placed in this chapel and they belong to this chapel. So it's fascinating to see, for example, the amount of available light that you have in a church and that you have in a small chapel, and how your eyes just have to struggle to recognize the shapes that are configuring all these paintings. I think it must have been wild, absolutely wild. I mean, imagine these paintings. Nobody. I mean, there are examples of extraordinary painters. For example, Tiziano painted years before Caravaggio. So we have examples of beautiful, realistic, naturalist painting just kind of peeking its head through what was high Renaissance painting. But imagine being surrounded by these very elegant Italian paintings from the early and mid 16th century, and suddenly you're met by this deep, deep atmosphere where all you can tell is that there are these figures, these real human beings suddenly emerging from this darker atmosphere. And that's perhaps the context that is most important with Caravaggio's painting. He wasn't trying to talk to God anymore. He wasn't trying to speak about divinity. He was trying to do, essentially, philosophical propaganda for the church at the moment. The church was fighting Reformation, so they were trying to win people back, and they were hoping that they could make things in the Catholic Church accessible. And one of the most important things that starts happening in terms of iconography is that regular people started understanding themselves as the subjects of these paintings. They started to see themselves reflected in these paintings. This is something that's absolutely obvious and super clear to identify in the 17th century with Baroque painting. Imagine how that must have felt, that you understood religion, the Catholic Church in particular, as something that was quite almost arcane. You know, it was something that was sealed off, and only very literate people, only very rich people that had the ability to read could understand all the occult symbolism that was hidden under all these stories and all these images that were produced. But you could argue that before Baroque, the paintings that were done were not meant for the people, were not meant to be understood by the people. If you understood the symbolism that was behind paintings during the Renaissance, it's because you were educated. But the church in the 17th century was not really interested in gaining educated folks. They wanted more people. They were losing people to Protestantism, and they were like, okay, we got to start doing something. And this coincided beautifully with artists having now the sensibility to reflect people that felt real in settings that felt plausible, with light that enveloped and bathed bodies and made them feel palpable. So all of these things added up to the idea of regular people feeling that they could finally make a connection with these images. So saints, like in the case of St. Matthew, weren't these, again, divine beings that were different from all of us. They were suddenly now depicted as one of us. You know, people that had led their lives as one of us, and they were suddenly touched by God, or they had a calling, and they answered to that calling, and they achieved sanctity through fulfilling those missions. This was all just an effort to try and connect with people. Again, I feel that we can't really begin to understand the impact that those images had at that point in time, because it is obviously not the world that we live in. And even though these spaces, they are still chapels within churches, even though the nature of these spaces hasn't changed, the way they must have viewed this transition towards this imagery back then, it must have been nothing short of revolutionary. It must have been something that nobody saw coming, nobody expected. And I'm pretty sure the images must have been so incredibly powerful that they just fit the narrative that the church was selling perfectly. That's exactly what the church needed. And that's one of the reasons why Caravaggio is an absolute genius. Yesterday I was making reference to particularly the painting of the martyrdom of St. Matthew, because I think it's a very, very strange painting. It is not uncommon for Caravaggio to have done early versions of paintings that we know now to be extraordinary. For example, the painting that's in the altar of this chapel, the painting of the Inspiration of St. Matthew, this is actually the second version of that painting. The first version was too risque, I'm going to say. It was very sensual even, and it depicted a close conversation between the angel and St. Matthew, because the angel basically was telling St. Matthew what to write, but there was a ton of closeness. And I think that even for the church, that was a little too much. That bridging the gap between the divine and the human was a little too close. There still needed to be some separation between God, between divinity, and human beings. But the first version, which we lost during World War II, it was just a little too close. It was a little too almost like private. And I'm guessing they still wanted to have like a separation between, the heavens and the earth. So Caravaggio ends up doing the version of the painting that we all know now. But this wasn't something that was abnormal. Caravaggio, for example, and I spoke about this with the conversion of St. Paul, he also does a first version of that painting. And they thought that painting was just too weird. It's a jumbled mess. I think Caravaggio had like the heart of a very mannerist painter. He's a very strange, peculiar painter. I think that while some of his compositions are clearly based on other classical subject matter, he was also incredibly innovative in terms of composition. I mean, he was doing stuff that nobody else was doing at that time. And I wanted to concentrate on the martyrdom of St. Matthew because there was a horizontal composition, an original horizontal composition that's underneath, this final painting that very much echoed what he was doing with the Calling of St. Matthew, which is the painting that's directly in front of it in the chapel. And I'm guessing that they asked him to just punch it up a little more, make that drama, that theatrical quality in his paintings just a little more evident. And he ends up doing this painting. He ends up doing something that we have never seen. I mean, the direction of the light, the way form is described, the way the figures are placed in this almost like abstract space, the way they're juxtaposed, the weird hierarchical but not really manner in which he understands the dimensions of the figures. The scales are so eclectic. I think that this composition is incredibly contemporary. I love that. I love that because I think that it is so jumbled, it is so all over the place, that the one thing that's keeping it together, the glue that's holding this piece together, obviously it's atmosphere. Obviously it's this darker atmosphere that doesn't really describe a space. I mean, there's moments where it hints at a space, but it ends up feeling like a stage. It ends up feeling literally like theater. And I think that the nature of that image is what ends up binding and making possible the fact that there's these tons of like little narratives going on in the painting that should not really work together, but he's able to just put so much, he threw so much into this painting that he was able to achieve this, again, this very eclectic mess, but it just makes sense. So for today, I wanted to see if we could concentrate on that theatricality and obviously not try to do a multi-figured composition because we don't really have time to do that, and that's incredibly complex. But I was trying to tap into some of that drama for today with a single subject matter. So Dani almost feels like this rocket that's taking off into space, and the base of this very slender pyramid, it's just a very light shirt. There's light hitting her chest that's actually flooding into the shirt, so there's no real differentiation between chest, and it's framed by this darker atmosphere, also framed by this darker mass of hair that is pulling you up to this portrait where we as observers, and this is a very small piece, we as observers feel like we're looking up at this figure. And even though I feel like I crop into my paintings quite a bit, like I really focus in on my subject matter a lot with the paintings that I've been doing in this project, I don't really paint a lot of the space that the figures inhabit. I'd like to believe that I always suggest that there is something happening outside the realm of the painting. I always feel that that's something kind of incredible. I always feel that if the painting can point to something that is happening outside the universe of this painting, I like it. I feel that that's like super, super interesting. So I can imagine Dani having this, very dramatic reaction to something that is beyond the parameters of the painting. And I particularly love that. So when I was doing this, it kind of reminded me of the Macbeth painting that Sargent did. It's kind of charged with some of that drama. That painting is absurdly amazing. I'm not comparing myself to Sargent. I would never do that. I'm not that much of an idiot. I know my place in painting, so don't worry about that. But I just have etched in my brain the look and the emotion that Sargent was able to paint. And when I was painting Dani, I was trying to feed off of that and solve a painting the only way I know how to solve it, but I was hoping I could get some of that energy. So that's going to be it for today. We concentrated on theater and drama that are obviously incredibly present in almost every single Caravaggio painting. So join us tomorrow where we will investigate another aspect of Caravaggio, and we'll try to figure out how to incorporate it into our own painting. Remember, the important part of this equation is the fact that we end up painting something. What we want to do is for our paintings to feel our own, first and foremost, but they are images that are conscious of the teachings that Caravaggio has provided us with. So that's going to be tomorrow. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Love you guys. Bye.